Con el permiso del Rabino en Jefe de Inglaterra y Commonwealth, Lord Jonathan Sachs y señora, con el permiso de todos los rabinos y rabaniot presentes, con el permiso del señor embajador de Israel, el permiso del señor embajador de Inglaterra y señora, especialmente con el permiso de nuestros abuelos del hogar israelita, a quienes especialmente invitados para que vengan a escuchar esta charla. Muy apreciados amigos, buenas noches a todos. Erev Tov Lekulam. Gracias por estar aquí. Es una gran alegría y honor estar frente a ustedes para iniciar oficialmente esta histórica visita al Uruguay del gran rabino de Inglaterra, Lord Jonathan Sachs, y su señora Lady Elaine Sachs. Estoy aquí en nombre de un pequeño grupo de estudios que vibramos con las ideas y con el estilo que el Rab Jonathan Sachs nos enseña judaísmo. Encontramos en el Rab Sachs una brillante capacidad de síntesis, una manera sistemática de presentar las ideas, siempre citando a las fuentes judías todas y poniéndolas en el contexto de fuentes del pensamiento universal. Una combinación muy difícil de encontrar. Todo esto con un estilo de escritura que genera en el lector tranquilidad, paz en el sentido de plenitud y mucho amor, posibilitando así la expansión de nuestra sensación de orgullo por nuestra identidad. Esta visita comenzó como un sueño. Nos imaginamos un día alrededor de la mesa, como lo hacemos cada semana los Shabbat por la tarde, con los amigos de la comunidad, los textos judíos y las interpretaciones del Rav Sachs. Pero esa vez nos imaginábamos no a Sachs a través de sus libros, sino con el Rab en persona mismo. ¡Qué locura pensar que eso algún día podría suceder! Pero la verdad es que nunca dejamos de soñarlo. Vivimos años con ese sueño y mientras tanto compartíamos nuestra pasión con los amigos en la comunidad. Y si algo tiene que suceder, va a suceder en el momento que tenga que suceder y de la forma que tenga que suceder. Como decían nuestros abuelos, Vasis Bashert is Bashert. Extendimos la invitación durante varios años hasta que un día recibimos la noticia y la brajá de que la invitación fue aceptada. Nuestro sueño se hizo realidad. Obviamente, entendimos la señal que la bendición era para toda nuestra comunidad. Y así fue que dimos forma a una agenda corta, pero amplia en espectro, lo más que pudimos. Un pequeño grupo de voluntarios, por supuesto ya fans del pensamiento de Sachs, nos juntamos en calidad independiente, sino por ninguna organización en particular, para organizar esta visita y ponerla a disposición de todos los judíos, de todas las corrientes de pensamientos. Quiero agradecer a cada uno y uno del grupo por la entrega en la coordinación de la visita y en nombre de todo el grupo, a todas las organizaciones de la comunidad por la incondicional ayuda en la difusión de este evento y la visita. Vivimos en una comunidad judía muy activa, que tiene el orgullo de ser la comunidad judía con el mayor porcentaje de aliyá del mundo por razones ideológicas. Esta comunidad se encuentra en estos momentos en plena transformación. Basada en su historia y no anclada en ella, está en la búsqueda de su proyección hacia un futuro. Pero las sociedades, las comunidades, no cambian por un decreto. Las comunidades cambian por la suma de pequeñas acciones de sus integrantes. Y eso es esta visita, una pequeña acción más. Siento que el Rav Sachs no viene con certezas, no viene tampoco con respuestas. El Rav Sachs nos recuerda que el judaísmo nos propone que nunca dejemos de hacernos las preguntas fundamentales de la vida. El por qué, cuál es el propósito, cuál es el sentido. Y que nunca nos conformemos con el presente que tenemos. Sachs nos enseña que el judaísmo nos propone vivir el mundo tal cual es, tal cual se nos presenta y no a espaldas a él, pero para transformarlo en un mundo que debería de ser. Y para eso tenemos que tener sueños y ideales para conquistar. Deseamos que luego que el Rav Sachs se vaya del Uruguay, haya encendido en cada uno y uno una chispa de reencuentro con un judaísmo significativo y que esa chispa sea catalizadora para continuar esta vivencia milenaria. Para llegar a más gente con el mensaje, mañana por la mañana el Rab compartirá una charla con chicos de preparatorios de nuestras escuelas comunitarias y por la noche recibiremos juntos el Shabbat en el Beit Knesset de Yavne. Luego el Rab cenará exclusivamente con muchachos en edad universitaria, nuestros futuros líderes. Por último, con la salida del Shabbat, compartirá una charla con padres jóvenes, compartiendo sus pensamientos en los desafíos que enfrentan los padres hoy. Y finalmente el domingo por la mañana estará partiendo a Londres. Entonces, ahora les propongo lo siguiente. Imaginemos nuestra mesa de estudios, imaginemos a esta sala como si estuviéramos todos sentados alrededor de una mesa, estudiando con nuestros textos judíos, con nuestra Torá y compartiendo los pensamientos del Rav Sachs. Y antes de invitar a la mesa, a la cabecera de la mesa al maestro, les voy a leer una versión breve de su currículum. Jonathan Sachs es el gran rabino de la Unión de Congregaciones Hebreas del Commonwealth desde 1991. Es la sexta posición desde que el cargo fue formalizado en 1845. Graduado en filosofía con honores en Cambridge y en Oxford. Su smijá rabínica es de Jews College y de Yeshiva Etz Chaim. Chief Rabbi ha sido profesor visitante de varias universidades en Gran Bretaña, Estados Unidos e Israel. Tiene 15 doctor honoris causa, incluyendo un doctorado en divinidad otorgado por el arzobispo de Canterbury. Cuando asumió su cargo, lanzó un programa a 10 años para toda la comunidad británica, que le llamó Década de la Renovación Judía. Y esto llevó a una profunda transformación de la educación judía en Gran Bretaña. La segunda década de su cargo la dedicó a la responsabilidad judía, poniendo énfasis en la dimensión de la ética del judaísmo. El gran rabino recibió numerosos premios, incluido el premio Yerushalayim, por su contribución a la vida judía en la diáspora. Fue nombrado caballero por la reina en 2005 y Lord desde el 2009, donde tiene su asiento como Baron Sachs of Aldgate in the City of London. Es periodista, contribuye para la radio, para la BBC de Londres con su programa diario El Pensamiento del Día y escribe para el diario Times y también produce varios programas para la BBC en la parte televisiva. Desde 1986, o sea, en 27 años, publicó 25 libros. Y en este momento, mientras estamos aquí, está saliendo el libro número 26. Y ya nos comentó que tiene en mente otros 25 libros más para publicar. Fuera del libreto o fuera de este discurso, nos comentó o hemos escuchado cuando en Alemania hubo una propuesta de eliminar el Brit Milá. ¿A quién llamaron para poder resolver ese tema? Jonathan Sachs. Cuando en Holanda hubo un intento del Parlamento de eliminar la kashrut, ¿a quién citaron? Jonathan Sachs. El Rab nació en 1948 y está casado con Elaine desde 1970. Tiene 3 hijos y 6 nietos.
Es un gran honor para mí invitarlo a dirigir sus pensamientos a la comunidad de Uruguay.
Marcelo, thank you for those wonderful words. Thank you and your fellow organizers for the great, great leadership that you show this wonderful community. And thank you for the privilege of meeting what I think is one of the warmest and most delightful Jewish communities in the world, this great Jewish community of Montevideo of Uruguay. I want to say thank you, if I may, for your wonderful contribution to British life. Oh, sorry, is there a problem? That okay? Don't worry if you can't understand me, no one ever can. I welcome this opportunity for thanking you for Uruguay's great contribution to British life, Luis Suarez. I thank you even more for your dedication tonight by missing the game between Boca and Nacional. I'm not going to tell you the score so far, but your prayers might help. And I thought maybe since I know you love football, I'd begin just as a kind of way of introduction by telling you the story that happened to me. It was really the first thing that happened to me as chief rabbi. You see, when I had been chosen but not yet inducted as chief rabbi, a new Archbishop of Canterbury had just been chosen and not yet inducted. And somebody discovered that we were passionate about the same football club called Arsenal. I don't know if you heard of this football club. It's a football club that, like Judaism, tests your faith quite often. And somebody said, would you like your first ecumenical gathering to be at a match at the Arsenal football stadium? A midweek match for obvious religious reasons. And so I said, wonderful. The Archbishop of Canterbury said, what a machaya. And we went, the two of us, to watch Arsenal play Manchester United. It was a glorious moment. An evening match under the floodlights. They took us down to meet the players. They took us out onto the holy ground itself. And the loudspeakers announced, tonight we have with us the new Archbishop of Canterbury and the new Chief Rabbi. And you could hear the buzz go around the ground, because whichever choice you made when it came to religious faith, that night, Arsenal had friends in high places. They could not possibly lose. That night, and this is a true story, Arsenal went down to their worst home defeat in 63 years. They lost 6-2 at home to Manchester United. The next day, an English newspaper published the following little paragraph in which they said, if the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Chief Rabbi between them cannot bring about a win for Arsenal, does this not prove that God does not exist? The next day, I gave my reply, which went as follows: no, it proves that God exists. It's just that he supports Manchester United. Friends, I've been asked this evening to ask and try to answer briefly the most fundamental question any of us can ask. Why Judaism? How can it help me, any of us, find our purpose in life? Obviously, in the space of one lecture, I can only give a very brief answer, but I will try. And here it is. The problems of the 21st century are overwhelming. There is turbulence in the global economy. There is a growing divide between rich and poor, within countries and between countries. The international political arena seems, in many parts of the world, increasingly unstable. We have problems with the environment and with the sustainability of a consumer society and so on. The problems seem so large, and each of us is so small. There is only one of us, one of me, and 7 billion people on the face of the planet. It seems as if each one of us is only a wave in the ocean, a grain of sand on the seashore, dust on the surface of infinity. And yet, Maimonides, in his law code, in Hilchot Tshuva, in the laws of repentance, quoting the sages in the Talmud, says a remarkable thing. He says each life is judged on its balance of good and bad. And so is each community, each city, each nation, the world. Lefichach tzarich adam lirot et atzmo kol hashana kula. Therefore, he says, each one of us should throughout the year see our life as if it were balanced, one half good, one half bad, and the world as if it were balanced, one half good and one half bad, and our next act will change the balance of our life and of the world. This is an extraordinary statement. It tells us that we can make a difference, a significant difference, that we can, in some small way, change the world. None of us is insignificant. This is a fundamental belief of Judaism. The rabbis said in the Mishnah in Sanhedrin that when a human being makes many coins in the same mold, in the same mint, all the coins come out the same. God makes each of us in the same mold, in his image, and yet every one of us comes out different. Each one of us is unique. Each one of us, being the image of God, is something of infinite worth. Or as the sages said, Nefesh achat ke'olam malei. One life is like a universe. And that is as radical a view of the significance of each one of our lives as you can get. And think about that phrase once more in the first chapter of the Torah. Na'aseh Adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu. Let us make man in our image after our likeness. What was radical about that sentence was not the idea that a human being could be in the image of God. That many civilizations in the ancient world believed. Who was in the image of God? Pharaoh, or the king, or the emperor. What was radical about the Bible is not that one person could be in the image of God, but that every person could be, regardless of color, or culture, or class, or creed. Every one of us can make a difference to the world. Every one of us is unique and irreplaceable. And because of that, the Catholic writer Paul Johnson said that Judaism stands at the very heart of the attempt to endow life, every life, with the dignity of a purpose. And I believe that this is not just a belief. What we believe frames our imaginative horizons, our framework of possibilities. If we believe we are insignificant, we probably will be insignificant. If we believe that we are a failure, we probably will be a failure. If we believe we can succeed, we may succeed. At any rate, we will try our very hardest to do so. No religion in history has asked more of its adherents than Judaism. God asked great things of us, and by doing so helped to make us great. Not because we are better than anyone else, but because our faith, our culture, our civilization has such high expectations. It tells each of us that we can make a difference. Let me give you one very small example. Mark Zuckerberg. Did any of you see the film about him? The Social Network? You remember how it begins? He has a row with his girlfriend. Now, what would you and I do if we had a row with our girlfriend? He didn't go off and get drunk, or kick the cat, or find a new girlfriend. He went off and invented Facebook and changed the world. Whole governments fell in 2011, the Arab Spring, because Mark Zuckerberg had a row with his girlfriend. That's a very Jewish thing to do. Something happens, so you change the world. However, let me give you an altogether better example, which I only came across last summer. I don't know how much you saw of it here in Uruguay, but last summer we had the Olympic Games in London, and they were wonderful. But immediately after the Olympic Games, we had something that was no less wonderful, the Paralympic Games. Did you see those at all on television? Jews did not invent the Olympic Games. That was the ancient Greeks. But the BBC told a story in a wonderful film called The Best of Men that I'd never heard before, about the man who invented the Paralympic Games. He was a Jewish doctor called Dr. Ludwig Guttmann. Dr. Ludwig Guttmann was, in 1933, the leading neurosurgeon in Germany. Then Hitler came to power. Jews were thrown out of the professions. For some years, he continued to work in a Jewish hospital, but then it was just no longer safe for him, and in 1939, he came to England. In 1944, the British government asked him to establish the first dedicated unit for treating paraplegics. People with severe injuries that meant they would never walk again. And he did so at a hospital called Stoke Mandeville. When Ludwig Guttmann came to see how paraplegics were being treated, he was shocked. People believed that because they would never walk again, they would never have a life again. And as a result, they were kept heavily sedated, bedridden, flat on the bed, and their average life expectancy was between 3 and 6 months. They had no life in front of them, so they died. Guttmann was horrified. And he believed that they didn't just have a life behind them, they had a life in front of them. Guttmann was a religious Jew, and he believed passionately in Moses' great command, Uvacharta v'chaim, choose life. So he resolved to give these patients life back again. And it was, at first, very painful. The first thing he did was he cut by half their painkillers, because their painkillers were keeping them sedated. And it hurt. Then he got them to sit up in bed, and it hurt. Then he forced them to use their arms. He got a basketball and started throwing it at the patients, and that hurt. And then he got them out of their beds into wheelchairs, and that hurt. And the patients and the doctors thought he was crazy and cruel. He was putting these people through all sorts of pain. but he was willing them back to life again. So one day he took them out of their hospital room into the garden in their wheelchairs. And then he got them to start throwing the ball at one another. And they started playing games. And then he got the doctors and nurses into wheelchairs to play games with the paraplegics. And of course, the paraplegics won. And for the first time, he saw the power of enthusiasm in them. For the first time, they started looking forward to tomorrow. So he organized more games. And then he organized national games. And in 1948, organized the first international games, the first parallel Olympics, the first Paralympics, which 20 years later, in 1968, was officially recognized by the Olympic movement. The film showed how his doctors and nurses initially thought that he was completely mad, and they summoned him to a tribunal. And there's a wonderful scene in the film in which the doctors turn to Gutmann and they say, these men are moribund cripples. Who do you think they are? And he looked at them and he said, who do I think they are? I think they are the best of men. And when this past summer, 4,000 Paralympics took part in the games from 140 different countries, and a whole population of humanity who had been written off, here they were, full of life, full of dignity. You saw how one man could change the world for so many people. Uvocharta v'chaim, choose life. I never met Dr. Gutmann, though I did speak to his children, because I only just heard his story, and he died several decades ago. But there was a man I did meet, the late Dr. David Baum of blessed memory, who was a religious Jew from Bristol in England. David was Britain's leading pediatrician. He revolutionized child care, child medicine in Britain. He created the Royal Society of Pediatricians, of whom he was the life president. David, being a committed guy, first of all created a number of medical inventions and technological advances that significantly reduced rates of infant mortality in the world. But being the kind of guy he was, he didn't leave it there. Having created a new form of childcare in Britain, he went and did the same. First in Brazil, then in Ethiopia, then in Thailand, and then went to Moscow, which was just opening up in the first years of perestroika, and completely changed childcare in Moscow, becoming a close friend of Mikhail Gorbachev. And it was in 1999, at the end of the war in Kosovo, as refugee children were coming back, that he was taking part in a sponsored bicycle ride to raise money for a pediatrics facility in Pristina, that he had the heart attack that tragically killed him at the age of 59. David was a religious Zionist. He left instructions in his will that he be buried up in the Galil in Rosh Pinah, which he was. And when people criticize Zionism, I tell them the story of David, because the last project that David completed was a state-of-the-art childcare hospital for Palestinian children in Gaza. He said, that's the kind of Zionist I am. I want Israeli children to have a future, and I want Palestinian children to have the same future. And that was David, Uvocharta v'chaim. You may think that these are intrinsically remarkable people. But then I think of Sue Burns. Sue Burns was a friend of ours in the Jewish community who in early adult life suffered from a condition I think is called osteoporosis, which meant that she became a complete invalid. She could not sit up, even in a wheelchair. She knew that she would be confined to her bed for the rest of her life, and she knew that the rest of her life would not be very long. Many people would, in conditions like this, be angry with the world. And the reason we took to Sue, the reason she was a wonder to Elaine and myself, was that I never saw Sue without the most serene smile. I will never forget the day that she phoned me up and said, Chief Rabbi, would you please come round? I have something to tell you. And I went round to see her, and she told me that within a few days, the doctors had told her she was going to die. She still had that serene smile. What happened to Sue? She said to herself, God must have done this to me for a purpose. And so she realized her purpose in life was to help other people suffering from her condition. So, and this is the 1980s, in early days of computing and internet, she had somebody install a computer and a modem by her bedside, and she established a network long before Facebook of all the severely handicapped people in Britain, and she befriended them. She phoned them up when she heard they were low. She put them in touch with all the specialists. She helped them in every way conceivable. She called it the Tikva Lifeline, the lifeline of hope. And that is what she did. She understood that famous line of Kierkegaard that the door to happiness opens outward. When you suffer, you can achieve happiness nonetheless by looking outward at other people who are suffering. And when she became the only person ever to receive her honor, her MBE, from Her Majesty the Queen, Sue became the only person ever to receive an honor from the Queen horizontal on her hospital bed. With the same smile she always had, she said, this award wasn't for me, it was for my fellow sufferers, and I am merely collecting it on their behalf. Sue Burns knew, even in the most difficult circumstances, Uvocharta v'chaim, choose life. But then you and I may think we are not Ludwig Gutmann, we are not David Baum, and we are not Sue Burns. So let me tell you one last story that always had a big impact on me when I first heard it. I heard about this in a book written by an African American called Stephen Carter. Stephen Carter tells the story in this book of how he and his family became the first black family to move to a white neighborhood in Washington. In the 1960s, Washington was still a very racially segregated city. And he says in the book, the first morning that after we arrived, I and my brothers and sisters sat on the front porch waiting to see how people would react to us. And he said they didn't. No one looked at us. It was as if we were invisible. And I began to think to myself, We should never have come here. We will never belong here. They will never accept us here. And he writes, as I was thinking these thoughts, a lady on the other side of the road, her arms laden with shopping, gave us a big smile, disappeared into her house, came out 5 minutes later with a big tray of drinks and cookies, came over to us, gave them to us, and said, "Welcome, how wonderful to have you in our neighborhood." He said that lady who died tragically young, her name was Sarah Kestenbaum, was a religious Jew. He said that was no coincidence. Religious Jews have a name for this kind of thing. They call it chesed, which means kindness, especially to strangers, especially when it's hard. That moment, he said, changed my life and made me realize, yes, I belong here. Stephen Carter is now a professor of law at Yale University, and I take this story from his book, Civility. I happened to be telling this story in the Young Israel Synagogue in Georgetown, Washington, and to my amazement, the people said, "Oh yes, Sarah Kestenbaum used to be a member of this synagogue. We hadn't heard this story before, but yes, that's the kind of thing she did." And that is how you change the world. If one life is like a universe, then change one life and you begin to change the universe. David Baum used to love telling the story of the starfish. It's a famous story, but he lived by this story. It comes from the anthropologist Lauren Isley. An old man is walking along a beach one day and he sees a young man picking up starfish and throwing them back into the sea. And the old man goes up to the young man and says, "What are you doing?" And the young man says, "Well, these starfish, if they're left out in the sun, will die, so I'm throwing them back into the sea." And the old man says, "How can you make a difference? There are hundreds, and on the next beach another 100. And how can you make a difference? You can only save a few." And the young man lifted up the starfish he was holding and said, "To this one, I make a difference." And that is the story David Baum used to tell. That is how you change the world. One life at a time, one day at a time, one act at a time. Now the question is, what is it about Judaism? And I certainly do not say that Jews are the only people who do this kind of thing. Many people do, but somehow we have made it our speciality. And why is it? What is it about Judaism that leads us to do these things? Again, I will be very simple and mention just a few things. But the first reason is obvious. We are going to remind ourselves of it in less than 2 weeks' time. We are going to sit down on the night of Pesach and hold a matzah and say, "Ha lachmo anya de'achalo avasanu." This is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in Egypt. Jews never forget the bread of affliction. On Sukkot, we live in a shack. What's the weather like in Uruguay on Sukkot? Is it okay? Kacha. It's a lot better than it is in England, you know. You're sitting in the sukkah, it's cold, it's wet, it's damp. And this is supposed to be Zman Simchatenu, the festival of our joy. That needs real faith. Friends, you sit in a sukkah and you remember all the people who are homeless. You eat matzah on Pesach and you remember all the people who still today are eating the bread of affliction. Jews never forget. The truth is, time makes you forget. Freedom makes you forget. Affluence makes you forget. Jews never forget. Zachor, Zachor, Zachor. 169 times the Hebrew Bible tells us, remember. We don't forget the suffering of the world. We don't forget our own suffering, and we don't forget other people's suffering. At the Seder night, we are going to spill 10 drops of wine as we mention the 10 plagues, because we not only remember our suffering, we remember our enemies' suffering also. Because Jews remember, We don't allow affluence to make us feel that if everything is right with us, everything is also right with the world. That is principle one. Principle two, there is something remarkable about Judaism. Many religions, even most of them in the history of the world, have been religions of acceptance. People know that bad things happen in this world. People suffer. There's violence. There is injustice. Bad things happen to good people. And most religions are a way of coming to accept this. Yes, there is justice, but not in this life, in the next life. Up in heaven, not down on earth. There is peace. There is reward. There is happiness. Many people criticize Judaism for saying, no, if there is to be justice, it must be down here on this world, in this life. That has been the Judaism of the ages. Judaism was never a religion of acceptance. It was always a religion of protest. Abraham stands up and says to God, Hashovet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat, shall the judge of all the earth not do justice? Moses says to God, Lama harayota la'am hazeh, why have you done evil to this people? Jeremiah challenges God. Job challenges God. Judaism is a religion that does not accept the suffering or the injustices of the world. As Marcelo said, Judaism is born in the cognitive dissonance between the world that is and the world that ought to be. And it is our task to make the world that is a little closer to the world that ought to be. And that is what the rabbis meant when they said that God calls to every one of us to be his shutafim b'ma'aseh bereshit, his partners in the work of creation. And that is why you find so many Jews as doctors fighting disease, as judges or lawyers fighting injustice, as economists fighting poverty, as teachers fighting ignorance, as therapists fighting depression and despair. And I believe that that too is what made Jews unusual, because we believe not only that you can change the world, but that you must change the world. That is why we are here. Thirdly, Judaism is perhaps the world's greatest example of a faith, of a civilization that predicated its whole survival on education. The Mesopotamians built ziggurats. The Egyptians built pyramids. The Greeks built the Parthenon. The Romans built the Colosseum. What did Jews build? Schools. I will never forget the occasion. It was a little bewildering. Some years ago, about 20 years ago, I was diagnosed with a very, very critically serious illness. I was rushed to hospital instantly before I knew what was happening to me. The next thing I knew, the first thing I knew after that, was coming out of my general anesthetic and waking into consciousness. And there's a knock on my hospital door, and I say, come in, and there is an 80-year-old Jew with a big volume of Talmud under his arm. He says, Rabbi Sachs, I'm so glad you're here in hospital. It means we can learn Talmud together. I'm trying to die, and he wants to learn Talmud. Jews are the people who learn. We are the people who made study a religious act. And we had universal, compulsory education already from the 1st century, from the end of the Second Temple period. A whole system set up. England didn't have universal compulsory education until the Education Act of 1870. Jews had it 1800 years before then. Theophrastus, the pupil of Aristotle, wants to explain to his fellow Greeks what are Jews. He calls them a nation of philosophers, as a result of which Jews became priests or prophets or poets or philosophers or sages or mystics. We, at the very nature of Torah as a book of law and our religion as a study of law, means that every Jew is a lawyer, or at least their brother-in-law is a lawyer. In the modern age, when Jews finally had access to Western culture, they revolutionized one field of thought after another. In physics, Einstein; in sociology, Durkheim; in anthropology, Levi-Strauss; in philosophy, Spinoza, Bergson, Wittgenstein, Isaiah Berlin; in music, everyone from Mahler and Schoenberg to Leonard Cohen to Bob Dylan to whoever else. All I can say is, not the Spice Girls, whatever you use for Havdalah, that's something different. Psychoanalysis. I mean, every one of those psychoanalysts except Jung was Jewish. Mind you, who, if you're not Jewish, who needs a psychoanalyst? Even the heretics, you know, even the heretics, 3 of the 4 great heretics of the modern world were Jewish: Spinoza, Marx, and Freud. The only one who wasn't Jewish was Charles Darwin. Why Charles Darwin wasn't Jewish, I don't know. He had a long beard, he was a total Epicurus, he had every qualification. It must have been a random genetic mutation. Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, said, we came from that kind of secular Russian Jewish family where you expected even the plumber to have a doctorate. It's this kind of tradition of study that somehow or other lifts Jews to their potential. But the truth is, I believe that the 4th element of Judaism that really made the difference is we are the people of hope. Judaism is the only civilization whose golden age, the Messianic age, is in the future. The only one. Every other golden age was in the past. Mind you, now we were in Buenos Aires yesterday and there's a new pope from there, so I am reminded of the story from the Harvard philosopher Robert Nozick, who said, when the Messiah comes, he will be met by a delegation of Jews and Christians, and they will say to him, welcome, Messiah, so glad to see you after all this time. Tell us, is this your first time or your second? And Nozick says, I advise him not to answer the question. One way or another, Jews are a very future-oriented people and a people of hope. And it is no accident that the state of Israel, born a mere 3 years after the Holocaust, should be the country whose national anthem is Hatikva, means the hope. All these things, memory, protest, study, hope, and the belief that we each have the power to change a part of the world, are rooted in Judaism's religious vision, recorded in its sacred texts, rehearsed in our rituals, invoked in our prayers. Yet because Judaism is not just a religion, it is also a people. And because we have not just a religious code, but also a culture, these things remain part of our collective inheritance, and you find them even amongst Jews who are not religious at all, even among Jews whose parents or grandparents or whose parents relinquished Jewish faith. But I do believe that religious identity is like inherited wealth. How long does inherited wealth last? On average, 3 generations. If your grandparents are rich, you too can be rich. But if you're the fourth generation and you want to be rich, you have to go and make it yourself. I believe the same is true about inherited identity. It lasts for 3 generations, but not more. If you can remember your grandparents, your Bubba and Zeta, or whatever those are in Uruguayan, in Spanish, I don't know, but if you can remember your grandparents who are still deeply Jewish, then you probably will stay Jewish. But for your children who don't remember that, can't remember it, for the 4th generation, we have to make it ourselves. And that is why I think we are people of the 4th generation, and that's why we have to make a special effort to renew our Jewish identity, or sadly we will lose it. And the truth is, I believe it is too precious to lose. But I do believe that the world needs Jews, not just Jews need Jews. I believe we have contributed, out of all proportion to our numbers, to many of the great things in Western civilization. I believe the fact that we are a very small people indeed is one of the reasons that we believe that each one of us counts. We are so small that if one of us is missing, or a dozen of us leave the faith, that makes a huge impact, which it wouldn't if we were enormous. When I became chief rabbi in 1991, somebody, knowing that we would travel quite a lot around the world, presented us with a directory of world Jewish communities. All the different countries in the world with an account of their general population and their Jewish population. And in 1991, the entry for China, which would not look like that today, but in 1991, the entry for China read China, population 1 billion, Jewish population 5. I said to Elaine, if there are 5 Jews in China, I can guarantee you 2 things. Number 1, there will be at least 6 synagogues. And number 2, someone somewhere will be saying the Jews are running the country. Somehow, for some reason, for a small people, we make an impact out of all proportion to our numbers. I believe that this is a privilege and a responsibility. And I believe we have to handle our Jewish identity with commitment, but with humility. I don't believe we have a monopoly of virtue or wisdom or any of the other fine things that make human beings great. But I do think we have something special to give ourselves, our children, and the world. And I sum this up with a little story which I just found very amusing at the time, and I share it with you. 30 years ago, 35 years ago, a long, long time ago, long before I was chief rabbi, and Elaine and I had done only a limited amount of travel in those days. And it happened that English winters are, I hate to say this, really, really miserable. I mean, the English are a tremendous and wonderful people, and you have to be to survive an English winter. And on one winter, it was so miserable. I said to Elaine, we've never done this before. Let's go somewhere where there is sunshine in the winter. Let us go to Eilat. Now, this was Eilat 35 years ago, and we mentioned it to some friends, and the friend said, Rabbi Sachs, please don't go to Eilat. The dress code in Eilat is not exactly rabbinical. We ignored the advice. We went, and they were right. There were a lot of ladies who were not necessarily observing Jewish standards of modesty. I spent the whole week with my glasses off, bumping into things, and we looked for somewhere which was vaguely acceptable for a rabbi to be. And we discovered it in the form, I don't know if they still have them today, of those glass-bottom boats where you go out and you see all the beautifully colored fish. And we went, and we were the only passengers on the boat, and the captain of the boat heard us talking in English and rushed over and asked, "Ateme Anglia, are you from England?" And we said, "Yes, why do you ask?" And he said, well, he went for a holiday the previous summer to England. And we asked him, how did he like England? And he said, "Oh, England, wonderful. The buildings, so old. The grass, so green. The people, so polite." And then he looked around at what was then a really barren wilderness of bare brown hills. And with a big smile, he embraced the landscape and said, "Aval zeh shelanu." But this is ours. Friends, there are other great civilizations. We have no monopoly on greatness. Aval zeh shelanu. But this is ours. Let us always wear our Jewish identity with pride. And let us go and be a blessing to our people and to the world. Thank you very much indeed.
Estimados amigos, muchas gracias por vuestra presencia. Hemos escuchado las palabras inspiradoras del Rav Sachs. También han sido inspiradores para nosotros sus libros, es decir, nos han permitido crecer más allá de nuestros límites como personas, también como comunidad y seguramente como país. Queremos invitar al Rav Sachs a que vuelva nuevamente a nuestro país y en el interín queremos darle a él un obsequio hecho con las manos de gente con discapacidad, con capacidades especiales. Todos nosotros tenemos capacidades especiales, él nos ayuda a encontrarlas y a través de eso es que podemos construir un mundo mejor, como él nos ha dicho. Muchas gracias, Rav Sachs. Detrás de una gran persona y detrás de un gran hombre, si hay una gran mujer, la Rabbanit Elaine, que acompaña al Rav en todos sus viajes. Queremos también homenajearla. Gracias a todos ustedes por la presencia.
כששואל את עצמי מי אני קצת ספרדי, קצת אשכנזי, קצת ישראלי, טיפ-טיפה גלותי. אני אולי דתי ואולי חילוני, אבל ביני לביני אני יהודי, וזה ייחודי. לא טוב יותר מהאחר, לא רע יותר, פשוט יהודי. לפעמים חייל, לפעמים תלמיד, יש לי המון עבר וגם רואה עתיד. לפעמים מתנגד ולפעמים חסיד, אולי גשמי אולי רוחני, אבל תמיד תמיד אני יהודי, וזה יהודי. לא רע יותר, לא טוב יותר, טיפה אחר, פשוט יהודי. פתאום חזרתי מרחוק, שנוכל להיות ייחודי, לא טוב יותר מאחר, לא רע יותר, פשוט
שום דבר לא יצליח לשבור אותי אחי, הנשמה שלי חלק מאור עליון נצחי לתקן את העולם, זוהי מהותי, נולדתי ככה, אני יהודי.
יהודי כמו בשאר הדתות, יש לי חגים, שבתות, מנהגים ומצוות. מזל טוב! למרות שכל אחד בטוח בצדקתו, בסוף כולנו יהודים לפני כיסא כבודו. אני מאוד פוחד משנאת חינם, אוהב את עצמי ואוהב את העם, הייתי פה ושם ובכל העולם, יש לי שתי דעות על מה שנשאר וגם דעה שלישית, כי אני יהודי וזה